I know that there are stories of real hardship here in our midst. And I know that probably all of us have lives that are to some degree or another marked by the disappointment of just things not going the way we wanted them to. And we all ask the question, where is God? And what is God up to? Surely he must be asleep at the wheel. And Matthew 2 invites us to consider a different answer. That God is with us. And he is working out his redemptive plan, but it does not look like what you thought it did. And it might actually involve none of your dreams coming true. Which forces us to ask ourselves, like, why are we in this Jesus thing in the first place? What are our real motives here? What are we looking for? And are we in touch with the real thing, which is the heartbeat of this Jesus of Nazareth who is committed to show us the love and the grace of God and to give us hope by his resurrection from the dead? Things might get worse for a lot of us. And it forces us to focus in our hope on the only thing we have hope in, which is the resurrection of the Messiah from the dead. And that's where I think Matthew 2 is trying to lead us.
Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells. I am so excited to share this Tim Mackie sermon from when he used to preach at Door of Hope in Portland, Oregon. Today, I shared a post that revealed the Bible interprets the Bible differently than most modern Western churchianity. What do I mean? New Testament authors like Matthew, Paul, and John use creative liberty when citing or quoting the Bible in their references in the New Testament. For a specific reference, you can go to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9. Do some digging to see exactly how the Apostle Paul uses Scripture to get his point across. This video will have many such examples for us to explore of how the Bible interprets the Bible. We'll have 2 direct citations early in chapter 2 from Matthew, going over Jesus' flight to Egypt and also the murder of innocents in Bethlehem. Sorry, there is no such thing as a prosperity gospel. Following Jesus will not open every door for you. When you pray for a loved one, they may continue to get more sick. When you pray about your job, you still might lose it. Suffering is not a question, it's a promise in this world. Where is God in all of this? Where is God in our suffering? Where was God when those infants cried out before they were brutally murdered in Bethlehem? Where was God on 9/11 when the towers fell and so many lost their life? This video will help us understand that God did not abandon us. Actually, God entered into every one of our stories of suffering. He did this through the person of Jesus, who is the Christ and now King of the world. Share this video with anyone who's suffering so that they can have hope from the only place that we can have it, the resurrection of Jesus. If you're not already subscribed, I want to take a quick second and ask you to do that. It takes a little bit of time for you, but means so much for the scope of this channel to help get the good news out about what Jesus has done for this world. Let's go meet Tim at Door of Hope and find out, where is God in all of our suffering?
In chapters 1 and 2 of Matthew, as we go through the book, we're working through what Matthew called the Genesis of Jesus. Remember the first words of the book, the Genesis of Jesus, the Messiah, son of Abraham, son of David. It's the stories of Jesus' family history and then the circumstances of his birth. And we're finishing those up today. And remember, the reason why Matthew has included these stories at the beginning of the gospel is not just because he's a historian and he geeks out on that kind of stuff and he wants to be complete. Because if he really wanted to be complete, of course, there would be a whole bunch of other stories that he could have included that he didn't. And there are other accounts of the life of Jesus in the New Testament that are considered complete that don't have anything about Jesus' childhood at all. And so we have to ask these questions as readers. Why are these stories here? And they're here, at least as we've kind of been exploring, because they're meant to tell us something not just about who Jesus was, but they tell us truths about who Jesus is and who he is for us as his people today. And they illuminate the character and the reality of Jesus. And so these stories today, these are the stories that typically don't make it into the Christmas play. right? So the flight to Egypt and these children being massacred and then like having to move back to their second choice town, of Nazareth. You're like, have you ever seen those like retold at the Christmas pageant play? Like, no, it'd be kind of hard to depict, and it would kind of kill the mood of the whole thing too, wouldn't it? So these but they're crucially part of the Genesis of Jesus. And these are stories, again, because we're familiar with them through the Christmas cards or whatever that come around during the holidays, we tend to read these stories through rose-colored glasses, so to speak. And they're just, well, it's Jesus. And of course, they run around and there's horrible, crazy things happening. He's the Messiah's birth or whatever, and we just kind of move on with the story. But Matthew has done something very profound in describing this part of the life of the infant Jesus and of his parents. And I want us to, as always, to kind of try and disassociate anything you think you already know about these stories and just put yourselves in the shoes of these characters, of this young mother, of this young father who's adopted this spontaneously generated son, right, into his family, and then like everything that happens to them. I mean, really try and think about what you would be thinking, feeling if these were your circumstances. You're a pregnant Jewish teenager, and that's just crazy in and of itself, like how that all went down. And then you thought your fiance was going to break the engagement, but then he has a dream, and then he doesn't. Like, that's a crazy week in and of itself. You know what I'm saying? Just that alone. But then, then far away, some Roman politician, right? The whole empire that's militarized your whole ancient homeland over the last 50 years decides they're going to raise taxes. And it forces everybody to go to their ancestral roots and take part of the census and so on. And so you're pregnant, quite pregnant, and you have to make this 80-mile trip on a donkey or horseback or whatever. And so that's really inconvenient and uncomfortable. And so then you have to do that. And then while you're there, somehow, we don't know, you get stuck there, away from your mom, away from your aunts, away from your midwife or whatever, from your hometown, and you give birth in a town that is not your town. And you end up doing so under really awkward, difficult circumstances, right? In whatever this kind of cave or whatever is represented by the manger. We don't actually know if it was like a stable, a cave, or spare room of a house. We don't actually know. But the whole point is that it was not ideal circumstances under which you give birth away from your family. And then it gets even worse. Because, of course, there's this whole thing about these really strange magicians showing up from the far ancient East, and they drop a load of cash in your lap. That's actually pretty cool, right? if that were to happen to you. But, it's kind of bizarre. And then there's these, shepherds who keep, filing in to want to see your baby, and that's weird. And they keep wanting to hold him, and you're like, please wash your hands or whatever. I don't know. Whatever. So, right, they're shepherds, So that's all kind of there's this moment of the birth, and that's significant, though we're not told anything about Jesus having a halo or him not crying. I imagine he cried and pooped like any young, human did. So there's that. But then, you're like, Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, and so on. And then it just tanks. The things just go from okay and awkward and inconvenient to horrible. Horrible. So you're a young mom, and you hear that there's Roman soldiers marching the 5 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and they're coming for your baby. And you have to flee in the middle of the night and start this 300-mile trek down south through the deserts of Israel and then of Egypt to get to most likely Alexandria, Egypt, where there's a big community of Jewish people living there. And so on the way, of course, you hear this report that those Roman soldiers went through the whole village of Bethlehem, and they rounded up all of the boys that have been born in the last 2 years, and they slaughtered them. And they're looking for your baby. And that haunts you as you go down to Egypt, and you're just stuck there. You don't know anybody, you have the Jewish community there, but your family's not there, and you're raising your toddler in this place that's foreign to you. And there you go. You're stuck there for the first years of your baby's life. And then you hear this report that, like, the big bad Herod who was trying to do all of this, he dies. And so you're like, oh, finally, the storm's blown over. So you go back and you're going to settle in your husband's hometown. If our son really is the Messiah, we should go to the roots and to this town of David where David was born. And then you show up there and then you realize, holy cow, like Herod's son, who's about as bad as Herod was, is the guy ruling on the throne now. And so, like, at the last minute, you're like, I guess, where do we go? We have to go back to Mary's hometown. And so you make the 80-mile trek back up, and then you go back to your small, little, no-name podunk hill country town where the rumor mill is just churning and will continue to churn for decades about your mysterious pregnancy. And that's about a 3-year period of Mary's life. Now, let's say that was your life. How are you feeling about your life right now? Right? I mean, really think about that. Really. I mean, you would... I know that there are very difficult stories in the room right now, very difficult life circumstances. But I dare say that this 3 years of this family's life is probably one of the most traumatic stories you could ever hear anyone tell. I mean, really think about that. And why did Matthew include these stories? It's like, Jesus is here, it's all amazing, and then it just crashes and burns, and it's these stories of terror and tragedy. What is going on here? And if you and I were in Mary's circumstances, I think that we would find ourselves in a place that many of us do find ourselves in, when hardship or tragedy or things unknown or fear hits our lives in some way, we start asking questions, right? We start asking, where is God? Why is all of this happening to me? And so on. I mean, can you imagine Mary's prayers while she's fleeing to Egypt and hears the report about the massacre in Bethlehem, looking for her son? I mean, what prayers did she pray that night? And did she perceive those prayers as ever being answered? Where is God in moments like that? In my mind, that's what these stories raise. Is where is God in the moments of the most horrendous evil or tragedies or fears that hit our lives, the storms that hit our lives? And for many of us, these things hit our lives, and it goes a few different ways. I think some of us, we get disillusioned, we get embittered or jaded because we're like, if Jesus was really real and if he was good, he would prevent this kind of stuff from happening to me, or God would prevent this kind of thing from happening in the world. For many people, when these things happen in life, they just ditch the whole thing, because if God was real or if he was really good, he would intervene and prevent this kind of thing from happening. And it seems to me these stories in Matthew 2 are trying to challenge how we think about God and suffering and when these storms hit our lives. And they challenge what I call is, I think, a very common myth about Christianity in our culture, which is, I call it the myth of religious fulfillment. It's the idea that I invite Jesus into my life, and so he died for me and my sins and my failures. I'm reconciled to God. And so now I have all of these hopes and dreams and aspirations for my life. And Jesus is gracious. He's good. And so, of course, he's going to help me make all of those dreams come true. And then it doesn't happen. Or then the opposite happens. Then your nightmares happen. And where is God? And Matthew, so he's going to do some very profound things in terms of theology and quoting scripture, but on the whole, this section of stories has a very practical, pastoral message to give to us, which is, where is God when it looks like the train has gone off the tracks and terrors and tragedies strike your life? And this story moves at that whole set of issues and questions in three movements. I don't know if you've noticed them, but there's 3 movements to this story. And each one kind of tells about something that happened that's horrible or terrifying or tragic. And then it concludes by linking it up to some kind of fulfillment, to the Old Testament scriptures. Did you notice that as it read through it? There are 3 different times. And so each one of these movements in the story is trying to explore or get at who is God and where is God in these moments of terror and tragedy. And so let's consider them as we go through the story. How you guys doing? Let's start from the top. So as Peter was reading, I was just thinking, verse 13, when they had gone, if you weren't here last week, you're like, huh? They? Who's they? Right? So they is these astrologers, right? These magicians from the far ancient East. And they had been working their astrological star charts, whatever, and they discerned that some really important, significant king was being born to the west, thousands of miles, and so they started this 2 years, just the craziest story in the world, they start this journey, right? And so they go to Jerusalem, big caravan. We're nowhere told that there were just 3 of them. Did you know this? I don't remember if Josh mentioned this last week. There were 3 gifts offered. But we're told that the caravan was so huge that the whole city of Jerusalem was startled as this thing showed up into town. So it was probably a huge caravan of people and quite a number of these astrologers. And so they come and they ask the king of Jerusalem this question. Never ask a king this question. Where is the new king that was just born? So just don't ever, if you meet President Obama, you'd be like, where's the real president? It's just no, don't do that. Really bad idea. Especially don't ask that question to a king like Herod, right? Who's deeply insecure and has a real violent streak. So bad question. They didn't know what they were doing, but it sets off this whole chain of events. And so they just left, right? They dropped this huge load of cash, essentially, in Mary and Joseph's lap, which they almost certainly are going to need over the next 3 years to do this whole journey that's ahead of them. And then all of a sudden they say, listen, you're not safe. Right? An angel appears to Joseph. You got to get out of here. Now you're a young mom. You have a baby. And then all of a sudden, you're not safe. Your baby has a price on his head. You got to get out of here right now. This is horrifying. Absolutely terrifying if this was you. And so they flee during the night and they get up and they go. And so here's terror and tragedy number 1, right? Surely, where is God? Why is this happening? Why can't we catch a break? It's just one crazy thing after another. Surely the train has gone off the tracks. And Matthew says, actually, no. What's happening here fits into a larger pattern. Have you ever heard of a story where God raised up a deliverer, but then there's some insecure, power-hungry king who uses oppression and violence to try and thwart God's purposes? I wonder if I can think of a story like that before. And Matthew's like, yeah. And what does he say? He says this, look at verse 15. He says, so was fulfilled what the Lord said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, what prophet is he quoting? You got a footnote to look at there? Hosea. Prophet Hosea, chapter 11. Now, here's what I think happens in most of our minds. We think, wow, this is really remarkable. So Hosea, predates Jesus about 800 years. And Hosea, had a dream, and he watched the little movie in his dream about Joseph and Mary and going down to Egypt and coming out, and then he predicted that it would happen. And we're like, whoa, that's so crazy, Nostradamus, but for real. So, right? I think that's how many people perceive what Matthew's doing here. And then, the 5 of you who care about these kinds of things, you go like, oh, Hosea, oh, that's in my Bible, so I'll just go up and go read the book of Hosea, and see Matthew, wow, that's really cool. So you go look it up, and what you read is this, Hosea chapter 11, this is the context here. When Israel was a child, this is Yahweh speaking through the prophet, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I, Yahweh says, who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. Now, just stop right there. So where did the little movie screen of Joseph and Mary going down to Egypt, did you see it play out anywhere right here? Now, yeah, not only did you not see a little Nostradamus-style prediction thing playing out right here, what you see actually here is a recollection of the past. This is the prophet Hosea poetically reflecting on the past story of the roots of the Israelite people. So Israel was a child. I loved out of Egypt I called my son. What story is Hosea recollecting here? He's reflecting the Exodus story. So, and actually in the Exodus story, in Exodus chapter 4, Yahweh calls Israel my firstborn son. He says to Pharaoh, let my son go. Let my people go, or let my son go. It's interchanged in the Exodus story. And so Hosea picks up this metaphor that Israel is like Yahweh's child, Yahweh's son. And so he brought the people out of slavery from Egypt into the promised land and gave them this really good land. And what does Israel do? They go and worship other gods and so on. And Yahweh's like, what? I taught you to walk. I mean, I made you into a nation and you do this to me, And they never looked to me. They didn't realize. It's a very powerful poem, Hosea chapter 11. So what on earth is Matthew doing? What's he doing right here? Welcome to the wonderful, strange world of how Jesus and the apostles read and quote from the Jewish scriptures. And if your only idea in your head is Nostradamus-style prediction, then this is just going to be madly frustrating to you. Because that's actually not what the New Testament authors are doing most of the time. They quote from the Old Testament scriptures. Jesus and Matthew, the apostles, they read the Jewish scriptures as telling one coherent storyline that's moving forward. It's all pointing forward. There's all these unresolved tensions and so on with Israel and the covenants and sacrifices and so on. It's all these dangling threads that are just left there as the story of the Old Testament comes to a close. And they see Jesus and Matthew, all the apostles, they see the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the gift of the Spirit, as bringing all of these loose threads together right here. And so he will use a passage like Hosea chapter 11, but he wants you to think of anytime, this is going to be frustrating or exciting to some of you, right? Anytime you ever see an Old Testament passage quoted in the New Testament, they're never just using or alluding to the words that they've quoted. They just assume you know the whole Bible inside out, and they just assume you know the 24 other passages that are all connected to the one that they just quoted. And you're just supposed to know all of that to make sense of it. And so, sorry, I don't know what to tell you, but I'll try and help recreate the trail for you, at least right here. So what's he doing right here? Matthew wants us to see something. Is he wants us to see that, is this the first time that some selfish, powerful human has tried to thwart God's purposes to save and redeem his world and his people? No. And so he wants us to see that in these events of the life of Jesus, that the train has not come off the tracks, but actually we're replaying a whole pattern that's already taken place once in history. And so Jesus, as Israel's Messiah, as the capital S Son of God, is replaying in his life the same story that Israel went through. So here's a cool chart, and some of you are bored right now, but I don't care, because this is cool. So think through, why has Matthew chosen these specific stories here? And part of it is because he's weaving a pattern into the early chapters of Matthew that recollect the story of the Exodus. So for example, it begins with this journey to Egypt. And then you have this oppressive king killing children. Now, where in the Bible do you have an oppressive king killing children? Well, that's how the Exodus story begins, doesn't it? Right? With the Pharaoh is threatened by the people of Israel, and so he orders the male Israelites, after they're born, the children to be thrown into the Nile River. And so Herod has become the new Pharaoh. If Jesus it represents the new Israel and the Son of God fulfilling all of the purposes that God has been working towards all along, then Herod becomes this new Pharaoh. And so you have God's Son called out of Egypt, and then Matthew's clever. This is great. So in the story of the Exodus, of course, after they're called out of Egypt, they go to Mount Sinai, and they're 40 years in the wilderness. And then they go through the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And the way Matthew tells the story is Jesus comes up out of Egypt, and as we're going to see here, he settles in the town of Nazareth. And then what's the very next story? It's Jesus passing through the Jordan, so to speak. And it's as if he's the people of Israel. He's doing and retelling in his own life the story and the fulfillment of the whole story of the people of Israel. And then where does Jesus go right after that? He goes into the wilderness. For how long? For 40 days. Now, not 40 years. He would have been like 70 or something like that afterwards. But the whole point is, do you see what Matthew's doing here? He's trying to get you to see that even amidst the most horrific circumstances, is God surprised or caught off guard by the evil of Herod? Answer, no. Did God ordain the evil of Herod? Answer, say no. Say it very quickly. Say it strongly and very quickly. No, definitely not, right? Definitely not. But is God surprised? This is how humans always respond. When he tries to work his redemptive purposes, it generates resistance. Because when God gets involved, it threatens the status quo of how we think the world ought to be run when he introduces his upside-down kingdom. And so Matthew's, it's very theological and quoting the scriptures and so on, but it's a very practical point. In the midst of this terror that Mary must be experiencing, Matthew reminds us that the train has not gone off the tracks. Yes, this is a terrifying, tragic experience. But despite that evil, God is still working his redemptive purposes. Which leads to the second movement in the story. Here, it starts in verse 16. So Herod realizes that he'd been outwitted by the astrologers. He's ticked. And so he does. He lives up to his stature as the new Pharaoh, and he orders that all of the boys in Bethlehem, 2 years and younger, be murdered. Given what archaeologists tell us and so on about the size and scope of Bethlehem, a couple thousand people, we can just do averages based off of, the birth rate in their culture and so on. Somewhere between 25 to 50 boys were killed that night. Absolutely horrifying. And you're Mary, and you receive this news as you're fleeing on horseback with an infant through the deserts of Egypt. That's just a bad day. That's a really, really bad day. And the first thing that you would be tempted to think if this was happening to you is clearly God doesn't exist, or if he does exist, he's just abandoned ship. Clearly. And Matthew comes along, and he's going to invite us to consider another option. Another option, that despite this horrendous evil, what is God's response? And once again, what does he quote from? He quotes from the scriptures. Verse 17, then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. We'll read the quote in a second. And then he quotes from Jeremiah here. Now, if you view what Matthew's doing as Nostradamus-style prediction, the little movie in his head, that Jeremiah saw the slaughter of these Bethlehem boys, on a little movie screen in his head, and it was predicted and preordained or whatever, then you've got a huge mess on your hands, I think, at least, right? Because then you have so you're saying God preordained that this thing would happen, and so on. But once again, if you go read, for the five of you who care, and you go read this passage in context in Jeremiah, you realize, whoa, there's something way more profound going on here. So allow me, Jeremiah chapter 31. How you guys doing? Okay, Jeremiah 31. So, where do we start with Jeremiah? Let's keep that up there, but let's just say, Jeremiah, he predates Jesus by about 600 years. And the key events in the most traumatic and tragic event in Israel's story happened in Jeremiah's lifetime, which was the big bad empire of Babylon came and surrounded the city of Jerusalem, besieged it for about a year, finally broke through the walls of the city, killed all kinds of people, burned the city, burned the temple to the ground, and assembled all the survivors of Jerusalem a little way south of the city in the place called Ramah, and chained them all up and took them in a huge prisoner caravan 2,000 miles over to Babylon into exile. Jeremiah watched this take place. And much of the book of Jeremiah is Jeremiah seeing this coming and then grieving and mourning this whole tragic experience. And that's what this poem is about. This is what the Lord says. A voice is heard in Ramah, which was the place where all of the survivors were enchained and the caravan begins in the exile to Babylon. Mourning and great weeping. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. This is what the Lord now says. Restrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your hard service will be rewarded, declares the Lord. Your children will return from the land of the enemy. And so there's hope for your descendants, declares the Lord. Your children will return to their own land. So what Jeremiah is doing is he's mourning and lamenting this loss and this destruction, the death of some Israelites and the exile of others. But then he sees this hope that Yahweh will stay true to his promises and somehow a remnant will come back here to Jerusalem, and God will still fulfill his promises to bring blessing to all of the nations through the family of Abraham. So what's Matthew doing here? What's Matthew doing? Now this is where, again, I'm sorry, I don't know what to do. This was a hard sermon to prepare because Matthew is such a Bible geek. Matthew is. And so I don't know what to do except to kind of help connect the dots for us to see the real profound nature of what he's doing. So what's happening here? Who's Rachel? Who's Rachel? Yeah, so Rachel holds this kind of iconic place in the biblical imagination. She was one of the matriarchs of Israel, and she was the wife of what patriarch of the family of Israel? She's married to Jacob. She's married to Jacob and, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel and so on. And so she's like Martha Washington, right, in the Israelite imagination. And if you read the story, there's a story about how she dies in the book of Genesis. You know it? Genesis 35, of course, we all know it, right? And so in Genesis 35, Jacob loved Rachel. She was the most beloved. He had 4 women that he was sleeping with. Jacob was a bad dude. I don't know any way to put it. So but he loved Rachel the most, apparently. And she was the last of his wives to give birth. And the last son that she gave birth to, she died in childbirth. Genesis 35, it's this very tragic story where she's weeping and grieving in childbirth, and she's dying. And then they're told that it's a son, you're going to give birth to a son. And she says, call him Ben-Oni. These are her last words, which means son of my anguish. And then she dies. And Jacob is so rocked by this event that he can't bear to have his son be named something that would remind him of his wife's death. And so he changes his name to Benjamin, son of my right hand, or Benjamin, as we call him. And where did Rachel die, weeping in childbirth? Where did that take place? If you read the story, it takes place right outside of Bethlehem. Right outside of Bethlehem. And I got a map here, just for to be extra geeky on the deal. Right here. So there you go. So here's Jerusalem. There's Nazareth way up high by the Lake of Galilee up there. And then you have down south, you have Jerusalem. And then Ramah, which is where Jeremiah is talking about. And then Bethlehem, they're all like just a few miles from each other. And so here's what Jeremiah is doing. He's depicting Rachel as weeping from her tomb over the Israelites, her children, who will be gathered up, some killed, some taken off into exile to Babylon. And over the centuries, her weeping reaches and mourns over the fate of the people of Israel. And Matthew picks this up, and here you have this story of yet more Israelite children being oppressed and being killed. And Matthew is saying Rachel's voice is weeping from her tomb, reaching over even more centuries. Because here it's the same theme. You have another Pharaoh, another king of Babylon, another Herod, thwarting God's plans, selfishly trying to preserve whatever power they have left and using violence to do so. And so Rachel, it would be as if like a poet talking about George and Martha Washington weeping from their tombs over the deaths of 9/11 at the Pentagon a few miles north in New York and so on. That's what Jeremiah is doing here. And Matthew says their voice weeps still over the tragedies in our day. Which means this. Again, this is all, Bible geek and so on, but think, what's Matthew saying here? Where is God in the midst of this tragedy? What's God doing? He's speaking through his prophets that he grieves and he mourns the tragedy of the human condition. He's not absent. He's weeping. He's grieving. It's very similar to what Paul the Apostle says in Romans chapter 8, when he considers the corruption and the mortality and the tragedy of the human condition. He says, where is God? He says, God is, through his Spirit, right there in the heart of our world, groaning, as in the pains of childbirth. This is the groaning, weeping God. That's the biblical depiction of God's emotions over the state of our world. It's very powerful. It may seem like he's absent, and these stories would invite you to consider that God is actually grieving alongside of us. Which leads us to the third movement here, verse 19. This is the last terror and tragedy that happens to this young family. Verse 19, after Herod died, the angel of the Lord came to a dream, and Joseph, get up, take the child, go back to the land of Israel. Those who were trying to take the child's life are dead. So he gets up, and you're Joseph and Mary. You're like, finally, we catch a break. So maybe the storm has finally blown over. And so they go up to the land of Judah. They're going back to the land of Israel. And almost certainly, they're trying to return to Bethlehem. This is where Joseph's roots are. This is where Jesus was born. They're going to settle down here. If he really is the Messiah, he should grow up in the town that David, right, Israel's first king, grew up in. But they go back, and what do they hear? They're like, oh no, Herod version 2 is on the throne, right? Like, dang it, why can't anything work out? And so they're forced to make, like, what are we going to do? And so at the last minute, they make the decision, got to go 80 miles further on horseback. It's a lot. Jesus rode a lot on horses as a little kid, right? And not ever for, like, happy reasons. And so another 80 miles north, where do you go? So they go back to Mary's hometown, to Nazareth, and as we're going to learn later in the story, this is the small podunk town where the rumor mill is still churning decades later, as people are wondering who this Jesus is and why should we listen to him in his hometown. And look at the way Matthew frames this. So we have to go all the way back. Archelaus is reigning in Judah. This is verse 22. They were afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, they went up to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. So once again, you have some moment of disappointment or tragedy or inconvenience happen in this family's life. And then Matthew reminds us there's a greater purpose at work. God is still fulfilling his redemptive purposes despite the disappointment that this all represents. Now, what on earth, what's he doing right here? So at least he quoted Hosea, and we knew it. He quoted Jeremiah, and he knew it. Who's he quoting this time? Well, he doesn't say, does he? What does he just say? The prophets. The prophets. And so, like, the studious, one of you who has some sort of Bible software, and you're like, where does it say in the prophets he will be called a Nazarene? And you'll, enter it in your little Bible software, and you'll get hits 0. 0. And the reason why it's 0 is because this phrase is found nowhere in the entire Old Testament. He will be called a Nazarene. What? What's happening here? Now, there's something interesting. So you notice in the previous two times, he quoted one prophet and then like actual words. Here, he just says, the prophets. In other words, he's not quoting just one particular prophet. He's quoting an idea or a theme that runs through the prophets. And here, Matthew is at his total Bible geekiness. He reaches his height here, right, of Bible geekdom. As because he's making a wordplay in Greek and in Hebrew at the same time. And people have puzzled over this. You guys, Christian readers have puzzled over this line in Matthew for 2,000 years. So I'm not going to wrap it all up right here. But at least I'll give my opinion on what I think he's doing, because it actually is really profound. It's Bible geek, yes, but it's really actually profound what he's doing right here. So there's a well-known Old Testament promise about the coming king from the line of David. It occurs in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 11. And the word that Isaiah uses is a metaphor to describe the coming king from the line of David. It says in Isaiah chapter 11, it says, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, and from his roots a branch will bear fruit." He's considering the fact that in the exile, it's as if the line of David got like a tree, clear-cut, chopped, and you just have the stump. But God is going to fulfill his promises to David, and so this king, future king, the messianic king coming from the line of David is going to be like a little teeny tiny shoot, boop, coming up right out of the growth of the old stump, a little green shoot. That's what he's saying right here. It's this metaphor. And from the branch of the line of Jesse and of David is going to come a new branch, a new king. And Isaiah was the first one to use this metaphor, but then Jeremiah picked it up, Zechariah picked it up, and so a very common kind of name for the coming Messiah was branch, stick man, or whatever, right? That was a common way that the Messiah was referred to in the prophets. Now, here's the word play here. So, and this is all connected to Nazareth and so on. So the name of Jesus' hometown, at least as they move there after all of this, is up there at the top left, Nazareth. That's how you say Nazareth, Nazareth. And then in Greek, it got translated into Nazareth, and then there you go. That's the name of the town we have today. The word that Isaiah uses right here, branch, the Hebrew word for that is natsir. Come on, that's clever. You're supposed to chuckle a little bit, I think, like, Matthew, that's brilliant. That's brilliant what you've done right there. So, natsir. And then that word, if you were to try and spell it in Greek letters, it's the word Nazareth means stick town. It's the sticks, literally. It's the sticks. And pun intended by him, not me. So Nazareth is a tiny little village way up buried in the hills of Galilee. No name, podunk, hill country town. It's the sticks, literally. It is stick town. And so Matthew, he sees this connection here. Jesus grew up in stick town. And Isaiah said that the Messiah will be stick man. Holy cow, you guys, come on, that's great. So that's funny. And we are like, wow, that's clever. And Matthew is being clever, but there's actually something more profound happening here, because Isaiah developed this metaphor throughout the book. And he saw that the future coming king from the line of David, he would be this branch, this new growth. But then he goes on to develop in his poetry and prophecies that this king is going to be rejected by his people. And in fact, this king is going to die and absorb the sins of his own people into himself in his death. And one of the most famous poems where he depicts that, the rejected, suffering servant king, is in Isaiah 53. And can you guess what he calls the metaphor he uses to talk about the suffering servant king? Isaiah 53. "For he, the suffering servant king, grew up like a young branch, like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, no great appearance to attract us to him. He was despised and forsaken by others. He was a man of sorrows, familiar with grief. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. We considered him punished by God, stricken by him, afflicted. But in reality, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. It's actually by his wounds that we are healed. When Jesus met and was trying to gather his first circle of followers, we're told in the Gospel of John chapter 1, he came across this guy Nathanael. And Nathanael found out that Jesus was from Sticktown. And what does Nathanael say? Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Answer, no. No. So, and all of this is connected here. Matthew wants us to see that even the place where Jesus grew up was a seeming disappointment to his parents, actually becomes the symbol of what Jesus came to do. Jesus comes to address the human condition. Where is God? Where is God in the midst of the human tragedy? And with all of these three stories, Matthew's trying to get us to see that the God revealed in Jesus, he is Emmanuel. But he is not here to make all of our wildest dreams come true. In fact, you and I live in a world where God so honors the dignity and the moral decisions of image-bearing human beings that he has allowed us to create hell on earth. And it's not because God is bad, it's because we're bad. That's the point of the biblical story. And so where is God in the midst of this huge mess that we've created? And what Matthew's inviting us to see is that God has actually become subject to all of the same terrors and tragedies that we experience. That's what these stories are about. He's Stickman, right? He's the Messiah, he's great. He grows up in Nazareth, which is connected through this elaborate wordplay, I'll give you that, but to this very profound idea that God has come in Jesus to redeem us by suffering on our behalf. Not to make our wildest dreams come true, apparently. They may come true. They may not come true. And Matthew's saying that has nothing to do with the character of Jesus. Because what Jesus reveals is that the heart of God is to enter into the human tragedy because he loves us. He loves us utterly. And that in Jesus, God is subject to the evils and the disappointments and the tragedies. Jesus was born with a price on his head, and he will be executed with a price on his head. And so whatever, the myth of religious fulfillment, the idea that Jesus is here to make my dreams come true, is so pervasive. And most of us, if I were to, ask and kind of tease that out, most of us would say, no, of course, I don't think that. But then when our lives go south and we can't catch a break and everything goes wrong, we end up ticked at Jesus because he's not making our wildest dreams come true. And we're like, what's going on here? And Matthew chapter 2 has a very pastoral message for us. It's that God is with us in the person of Jesus. And Jesus, his parents, his youth, every part of his life was marked by the disappointment of human existence. And it's the same disappointment that marks most of our lives, too. And the only hope out of this whole mess that the story gives us, then, is that this suffering servant will bring healing through his wounds, because God's love and commitment in Jesus to disappointing people whose flaws and failures have made our world what it is, that his commitment and his love for our world and for each of us is so utterly strong and passionate that even our own sin and mortality and the evil that the Herods and the Pharaohs cause can't overcome his love for our world. And that's what the meaning of resurrection is. The hope for our world is the resurrection of Jesus. And that's where Matthew's gospel is going to end. And we'll get there in 2 years or something from that. But that's where the story ends. The same baby born with a price on his head is the same Messiah crucified by the Romans. And it's the same Jesus of Nazareth who is raised from the dead as the hope of the world. I know that there are stories of real hardship here in our midst. And I know that probably all of us have lives that are to some degree or another marked by the disappointment of just things not going the way we wanted them to. And we all ask the question, where is God? And what is God up to? Surely he must be asleep at the wheel. And Matthew 2 invites us to consider a different answer. That God is with us, and he is working out his redemptive plan, but it does not look like what you thought it did. And it might actually involve none of your dreams coming true, which forces us to ask ourselves, like, why are we in this Jesus thing in the first place? What are our real motives here? What are we looking for? And are we in touch with the real thing, which is the heartbeat of this Jesus of Nazareth, who is committed to show us the love and the grace of God and to give us hope by his resurrection from the dead. Things might get worse for a lot of us, and it forces us to focus in our hope on the only thing we have hope in, which is the resurrection of the Messiah from the dead. And that's where I think Matthew 2 is trying to lead us. So that's a light topic, right? Like, that's a light place to leave us, but I think it's the perfect place to lead us as we go into the bread and the cup here together in worship. And as we have time to pray and to sing and to reflect, I would just encourage you to ask yourself, where are you at in terms of life's disappointments? Some of you are living a nightmare right now. Some of you are living with disappointment, and just to be honest with Jesus about that. And then to weigh your own motivations in your own heart. And as we come to the bread and the cup, this is the place where Jesus knelt in the garden, crying, weeping over everything that was about to happen. Jesus' wildest dreams were not coming true in the Garden of Gethsemane. But precisely that road through suffering into resurrection is the way that he paved for us and our hope for the future. And so let's just ask Jesus to speak whatever truth we need to hear as we come to the bread and the cup.